All right, I guess we are underway. Welcome, everybody. I'm David Kirkpatrick, the founder and editor at Taconomy. We haven't had one of these virtual sessions for a while. During the pandemic, we were virtual all the time. Part of the reason we haven't had them is because we've been so busy planning some actual real-world physical events that are looming in the near future, most notably the Health and Wealth of Our Planet conference here in New York City on Tuesday, September 20th, where at least one of our panelists, Arya, will be helping to moderate a session on this same topic with a slightly different spin, but carbon accounting will be part of that program. We open with the president of the Club of Rome talking about 50 years since the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth report, and we end at about, we go from like 9 to 4:30 on Tuesday the 20th. Our closing speaker will be Seth Godin, who has a new book out called The Carbon Almanac, which is pertinent to what we're talking about today. Somebody who's made a real pivot toward climate obsession, as so many of us seem to be doing, thankfully. So we also have a Taconomy 2022 conference in November in Sonoma, California, November 13th through 15th, which is a very big project for us, resuming our historic annual retreats. And we'll have Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa, Jeffrey Katzenberg, epidemiologist Larry Brilliant, all kinds of other great people. Just this morning, my colleague Caitlin and I were talking with somebody who works with Fatoumata Ba, who's going to be speaking there, who is a Senegalese entrepreneur and a tech investor, really interesting person. So anyway, let's get underway. What we're talking about now is carbon accounting, which actually isn't really quite as dweeby as it might sound. It's really a critical facility that essentially, I think what we'll learn, doesn't really exist in the form that it needs to, especially given the urgent challenges that the world faces. We hear a lot about carbon goals, the Paris Accords goals, companies making net zero promises, but you can't really be net zero if you don't actually know what you're emitting and how your actions in remediating your emissions actually are having an effect. And I think what you'll learn is that much of the work that companies are doing now, however good their intentions, is based on some very shaky foundations. So that's really what we'll be talking about today with our two extremely well-informed participants, both of whom are part of the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investing. Aryadita Balakrishnan, who I thank for helping us put this together, is a researcher there and a longtime friend of Taconomy's. I'm going to ask him in a second to just describe the center. John Biberman, who is a more longtime center researcher and expert in this area, is really deeply immersed in the realities of what is happening with carbon accounting and what needs to happen with carbon accounting. So first, I want to just ask Arya to explain what the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investing is. And then I'm going to ask John to just sort of lay out the landscape as he sees it for carbon accounting. So Arya.
Thank you, David. It's good to be on a Taconomy platform. And as always, you guys are having important conversations, so it's good to be a part of it. To give you guys a little bit of background on the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, the center is about 10 years old. It's a joint center between the Columbia Law School and the Earth Institute at Columbia University. The idea behind the center is to help investors make more informed decisions on international investments and further the sustainable development goals through investing. So the center looks at several key areas. Among these are extractive industries, which is mining, metals, and several other industries in the space, agriculture and land, and then also looks at the finance industry and what kind of impact the finance industry can have on achieving the SDGs. Carbon accounting is a major part of the work that the center is doing, and John in his next part will tell you a lot more about the work of the center. But the center is involved across projects with groups like the EDF, with the Colorado Schools of Mines, and the United Nations on a wide variety of projects.
Fantastic. Thank you, Arya. And just to finish early what I said earlier, you're all, of course, invited to join our Taconomy, Health and Wealth of Our Planet, Taconomy and Worth, jointly hosting this conference in New York at City Winery on September 20th. And this session really is intended to be part of the lead up to that important conference, which will be entirely about businesses' responsibility around sustainability and climate action, with a very strong tone that business is not stepping up sufficiently. But we will have chief sustainability officers from US Steel, FedEx, Ericsson, other companies, as well as a bunch of great speakers from EDF and other interesting organizations. So, John, to you. First, would you just tell us exactly what you do, just a little bit about yourself, and then I'm going to just turn it over to you to tell us what we need to know about carbon accounting.
Yeah, David, thank you for the introduction. So as Arya mentioned, I'm one of the senior researchers here at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and I work on a number of projects related to mining, extractive industries, and energy as well. And as part of that, I'm the main researcher on our project for what's called the COMET Consortium. COMET stands for the Coalition on Materials Emissions Transparency, and it's an initiative between ourselves, the Colorado School of Mines, UNFCCC, which is the United Nations, and then RMI as well, to work towards harmonizing carbon accounting standards for basic commodities in the materials sector towards improving the system as a whole.
Awesome. So in summary, what's going on with carbon accounting?
Yeah, I think you'll find that it's not dweeby at all. It's actually quite interesting. So carbon accounting, just to quickly define it, it is the process of identifying who is creating emissions and how much. And that's something which we need for a lot of goals. We need it for fulfilling the pledges which are made under the Paris Agreement in order to track the emissions which are created by countries within their national inventories. We need it for building policies in order to fulfill that. So we need it for emissions trading systems to understand how much is produced by which corporations and how much can be traded back and forth between them. We need it for things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which is a similar system layered on top of international trade. So it's a really critical building block to a lot of the policies which we have to control greenhouse gas emissions and ultimately keep climate change in check. Now, the way our carbon accounting system has evolved is it evolved from a series of industry-based voluntary disclosures. So you would have a system used by the steel industry. You would have a system used by the aluminum industry. And at the very outset, these industry associations, policymakers just wanted to get something on paper on the table so they could have some sort of reporting about what emissions were being created. And over time, all of these disparate, decentralized systems sort of calcified into the carbon accounting system that we have today. And the outcome of that origin is that there is a lot of discrepancy between systems, both within industries and between industries. There is a lot of misalignment, especially when multiple methods can be used for a sector. And that creates a lot of loopholes which an unscrupulous company can squeeze through in order to report fewer emissions and have less reported responsibility than they otherwise should. Loopholes which allow them to report achievement towards net zero, which they haven't actually made. And that also means that the data about these emissions is less usable by policymakers, by the general public, by advocates, by shareholders, other stakeholders as well. So what we really need is a harmonized carbon accounting system which is applicable across sectors, which maps to systems that we already have in place for financial accounting and which can contribute in a more meaningful way to emissions reduction and limitation of climate change as well.
John,
So
let me just quickly ask you a question about what you just said. Just give us a rough assessment of how close we are to having that set of standards you just said we need.
yeah, so for the moment, we're not particularly close, but there is progress in the right direction. So if I can, I'd like to lay out some of the issues more granularly that are going on in the system right now and what's being done to address them. So first of all, system boundaries. So in carbon accounting, similar to financial accounting, system boundaries refers to what emissions are being counted. What is a company responsible for reporting? So because carbon accounting originated in this way, we have specific boundaries which are assigned to specific industries. And that's problematic because it is flexible where it needs to be inflexible, and it is inflexible where it needs to be flexible. What do I mean by that? Well, every facility is different, right? Say for a steel producer, some steel producers will have certain processes happening on their site, others will not. Well, because we've defined this in a certain way, we don't necessarily allow for that flexibility. But at the same time, because we define methods for industry by industry by industry, it doesn't allow for accommodation for the heterogeneous nature of supply chains as they actually exist, right? So we have some system boundary issues. Another major one is that a lot of carbon accounting methodologies don't really distinguish between system boundaries for ownership versus control. So they don't specify whether you should be reporting your emissions based on who owns what parts of the site or who controls what parts of the site. And that creates gaps which can be exploited. You can outsource something to a subsidiary or another company, and then those emissions are not your responsibility anymore. So that's the system boundary issue. We're not calculating from the same base. Then there's a lot of discrepancy and questionable data that comes into how the emissions themselves are actually calculated once you do have that base. So there are multiple methods for calculating greenhouse gas emissions. What is usually used in the estimation process is something called an emissions factor, which calculates the greenhouse gas emissions based on a certain unit of either input or output. And there are a few ways in which that can be phrased, which leads to some inconsistencies as well. Some emissions factors are based on the heat potential of fuels. Some are based on volume and mass. And when you have fuels that are, for instance, at different pressures or different grades of coal, then the difference between those two units can become quite great. There's also a separate calculation method called the mass balance approach, where you measure the difference between carbon going into the system and carbon being released out of the system. And the difference between that is supposed to be associated with the amount of carbon dioxide emissions. But that has some problems as well. One is that it assigns all carbon to carbon dioxide when we have other greenhouse gases, which are hundreds or even thousands of times more potent, like methane gas, like perfluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, etc. And so the mass balance approach doesn't really take that into account. So we have a conflict between the basic philosophy of how these emissions should be estimated. Going back to the emissions factors, much of the data which is used for these emissions factors are based on world averages from data, which in some cases is up to 30 years old. So this is data which doesn't really have a very strong relationship with the world that we live in today. And in addition to, the problem of that data being out of date, obsolete, it also, by using these world averages, creates a little bit of a moral hazard issue where a company which is far dirtier than those averages can free ride off of what other companies have reported in the past. And even if they're reporting off world averages from today, they can free ride off of reductions that other companies are making today. So for all these calculation methods, there's sort of a tier system which is used. Tier 1 is calculation based on these global averages. It has a lot of these issues that I've outlined. Tier 2 is about local averages, plant-specific averages. That's a little more clear. And then tier 3, which we're arguing for, is just direct, straightforward emission measurement on site at the plant. And we believe that's the most straightforward way to measure your emissions, is just by measuring them directly. So those are the main issues that I can touch on some more details related to things like indirect emissions, scope 3 emissions, which we can go into depth with, electricity, but I'll follow you, David.
Okay, John, thank you. Really, really great start. And I have a few follow-ups. And then in a little while, after John and I talk a little more, Arya is going to sort of lay out the landscape of sort of the organizational back end that has emerged and the, kind of regulatory association-based ecosystem that has emerged as companies genuinely are saying they really care about this. But John, so this issue of the tiers is quite fascinating. I mean, it's all totally, and it's complicated because it's not the same as scope 1, 2, and 3, which is a whole nother part of this measurement process. And maybe I'll ask you to define that in a second. But this point that if a company says they have a certain amount of emissions today, let me just make sure I understand it correctly. They're basically doing that because somebody has calculated averages for their industry, often based on data that's decades old, that they then benchmark themselves with, and any changes they make, they would apply to the averages that they took from industrial, sort of overall industry calculations. Is that sort of roughly accurate in terms of the current status?
Yeah, they're allowed the flexibility to do that. Granted, they're encouraged not to, but the rationale behind this is it's very similar to the way in which the carbon accounting system was first constructed. It's the logic that we want to allow anyone to be able to make this calculation and to report this voluntarily, even if they don't really have the capacity to do so. And that was useful at the outset, but now it's turned into something which is much more of a hindrance. And it's a similar issue with the system boundaries as well. You can very easily report reductions just by redrawing your boundaries in certain ways, by lopping off certain upstream emissions, certain emissions which are associated with downstream as well. So that's one reason why we need a more harmonized system, which is not siloed between these industries, but allows for both goods and carbon, not just carbon, all GHG emissions to be passed between industries in the same way that they are in the actual supply chain that exists.
Right, but presumably we also need regulatory clarity about some very specific things that even in the EU, where they're way ahead of us on many of this stuff, and maybe China is a possible exception here, but because they're very far ahead on some of these things, which I want to get into in a minute. But because there aren't clear standards and rules that are obligatory about how you calculate things, essentially today, companies can almost say anything. Is that pretty much the case?
Yeah, that's fairly accurate. So some of you may know that the SEC has just released a draft rule requiring companies to include climate disclosures in their reports. And that's a big step. But what they didn't include in that rule was any sort of standardization as to the method which has to be used to make those reports about what emissions are associated with your business. And because they haven't specified a method, it means that companies can use any method or any approach they want. Now, granted, there is a little bit of auditing associated with this, but the auditing standard in carbon accounting, going back to the origin of the system, is, quote, we cannot find evidence that this was false, right? Sort of a double negative structure. And that's very different from saying, we've assessed this and found that this analysis was rigorous and true, which is where we actually need to go. So what role could regulation play, either from the government level, or what I think could also be a good player for this would be bodies such as credit rating agencies. I would love to see a carbon accounting system that mandates some sort of grading for the quality and rigor of the data used to make those assessments, because very similar to credit reports, this is about the level of credibility that your report has, right? It's about how much a stakeholder, an investor can trust that you are making the emission reductions that you need to. And by the way, that's something which bears on their fiduciary responsibility as well, because it's associated with policies like carbon taxes, trading systems, and border adjustment mechanisms, which will impact their profits down the road.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the proposed SEC regulations, for which comments I think have just been closed and saying that they don't really have an accounting back end. What about Europe, where they are further ahead of us regulatorily? They already have a law that requires, I think, companies above a certain size by the end of 2023 to be reporting their emissions. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, they have that, and they've even gone a step further than the SEC in requiring certain major companies to have actual net zero plans, right? But they still haven't quite built out the accounting backend in the way that we would like them to.
They have,
So,
even though
yeah.
even though they have an auditing requirement that goes into effect in 2025. How are they going to be able to audit it if they don't have accounting standards?
It's the same auditing standard that we just described, right? It's the auditing standard of we could not find evidence this was false.
Yeah, that's not really good enough. So let me just quickly ask you a big picture question. In your opinion, and maybe the answer to really ask the question in a tough way, across the board, do you think companies that are making claims about their emissions today are generally exaggerating their accomplishments?
I don't just think that, so the companies think so as well. There was a recent report done by VCG, I don't remember based on what industry, but it was something on the order of like 76% of companies who said that they cared about doing this, they cared about reporting things the right way, but they either did not have the tools or the capability or all of these other factors which would allow them to do so. And as a result, these companies felt that they were reporting emissions reductions that were not based on reality, that their net zero plans were not based on reality. So there really is pressure from the private sector to do this, but they need regulatory support, and they also need support which technology can provide in certain ways. Technology can do both good things and bad things for this landscape as well.
Yeah. So, but concretely, is there pressure from industry for government to act with and really to create the kinds of accounting structures that you're calling for, or is it not yet to that level?
I think what industry wants above all is clarity and consistency. It's very hard for them because on the one hand, this voluntary structure has left it so that they don't know what standards to use, right? For people within these industries who are interested in elevating the quality of their reporting, not having that kind of regulatory pressure puts them in a difficult spot, because if they do try to improve their reporting, but they don't have, say, for instance, the data quality that they would like, then it's sort of a lose-lose situation for them, because it exposes them to bad publicity, pressure from activists, without having some sort of backing that they can fall back on in terms of this is what we're trying to do, we have the best intentions, etc. So I think that they're looking for this kind of backing so that they can up their game.
Yeah, well, that's good. I mean, I do think there is a lot of genuine goodwill on the part of businesses that they really want to make progress, and that's the good thing. But listening to you, it's a little terrifying to realize the degree to which we are essentially in the fog in terms of what really can be done. And I think it's fascinating, and I'm going to get to Arya in just a second, but I think it's fascinating that your bottom line recommendation is that companies ought to actually measure emissions at the source in order to create a trail effectively that their suppliers and customers could then tie into for their own reporting. But it's also amazingly interesting. Things like there's another example I want to just quickly get to. You mentioned that the averages assume certain things, but in fact, if you're in a given industry, I think you use steel as an example, you may be using slightly different processes that the historical averages don't factor in, right? That's one possible variable that really can only be accounted for with actual on-site measurement. Another that you pointed out, which is not so much for an industry like steel, but would potentially apply to any company, given that so much of the energy that companies use is electrical, that the sources of electricity vary dramatically in terms of their carbon intensity. And even as you pointed out to us in our prep call, even by not only by location, you might be located near hydroelectric, which means you're in a good place, or you might be located where you use a coal plant. But in reality, even during the day, the sources could shift. So if you're generating using energy at 8 p.m., you might be using cleaner energy than if you're using it 11 a.m., right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, in general, the most rigorous estimation method that's used for carbon accounting methods for measuring the indirect emissions from electricity, which is consumed by a producer, is you either look at power purchasing agreements. So you say, okay, we've purchased this amount of power from a certain facility, and this is the emissions factor associated with the power produced at that facility. Or if you don't have that, you do sort of a location system. You go, here are the plants in the area. This is where we get our electricity from. They emit so-and-so, therefore these are the emissions from the electricity that we consume. But this is not something which is consistent throughout the day or even throughout the year. Modes of electricity production shift. During certain times of the day, both wind and solar can contribute more to the grid than others. During the nighttime, maybe it's more fossil fuels like oil, gas, or coal, right? And there was a recent study which I saw, which found
the opposite of what I said, actually. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there was a recent study I saw which found that if you have an unscrupulous company which wants to reduce the emissions that they are reporting, what they can do is they can just take an emissions factor from the grid at a certain time of day, and that can be up to like a 30 or 35% reduction in the emissions that they actually have to report, just by timing that measurement, when in reality, maybe this facility is consuming electricity all throughout the day.
Yeah, wow. Okay, I want to turn to Arya, although, and one of the things that we want to come back to, which we haven't even gotten to, is this really interesting issue of carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the political ramifications of the fact that Europe is putting that into place in the near future. But Arya, tell us what you're going to tell us, and then I think you have a graphic to show to kind of illustrate some of your points.
I do, yeah. So I just shared the graphic as well. So in case I'm not able to share it, could one of you please share it? I think the work that I'm doing at CCSI is looking at what the finance industry can do to achieve its net zero commitments. What we've seen is that since the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was an agreement between countries, a lot of companies have come together on a wide variety of platforms, including the Paris Agreement itself, subsequent COPs that followed the Paris Agreement, and almost periodically every year surrounding Climate Week, to make net zero commitments. These net zero commitments are short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Pretty much all of them agree on what the short-term commitment should be and what the long-term commitment should be. It's the medium term that has left a lot of interpretation open. And it's the medium term really where I think carbon accounting sort of has to move forward and progress to add the most value to what some of these companies are going to do. So I'm going to try and share my screen if I'm not able to. Do you guys see that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a little bit of tiny type, but if you talk us through it,
I can zoom in as I move. So as we see here at the center is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. The GFANZ has really emerged as the central platform of net zero commitments of the finance industry. The GFANZ is chaired by Mark Carney, who is the former chair of the English Federal Reserve. And basically the GFANZ has under its wing several net zero commitments, which are specific to specific investor types. So there's the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, and the Net Zero Banking Alliance, among a few other less major alliances. So the way the GFANZ is structured is that it is the private finance arm of the Race to Zero, which you'll see on the top left-hand side of the screen. The Race to Zero is the United Nations net zero initiative that is agnostic of industry. So it applies to every industry. There are several companies all over the world that have made varying degrees of commitments. But GFANZ is particularly interesting to me and to the work that we're doing at CCSI, because Mark Carney at last year's COP26 said, we have all the money we need to achieve net zero. He said, there's $130 trillion in play, and GFANZ members are putting up that money to achieve net zero. Now, that's a problematic statement for several reasons, but one of the key reasons that I think of, especially in the context of carbon accounting, is that the accounting framework is just not in place as yet to make these commitments a reality. There's also issues associated with the voluntary nature of these commitments, and the fact that it's really, in a lot of cases, the industry trying to get ahead of regulation. But industries are only happy to get ahead of regulation and regulate themselves when things are going well. I think it really depends on the situation in the economy if we're leaving all of our trust to industry to regulate themselves, because a lot of these initiatives came up when the markets were doing really well and the economy was high growth on the rise. But as we see things sort of change over the last couple of months, we're also seeing a change in the tone of conversation of some of these industry and business leaders. So really now is the time where you see that the industry cannot sort of be left to themselves to regulate themselves. But I do want to point out some of the key initiatives outside of GFANZ. One of them is the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, which is doing a lot to standardize carbon accounting, and especially for the financial industry, offering a lot of guidance. The other is—
Are you really fast? Is that effectively among other things, a lobbying arm to achieve what I was asking John about? Is that a way for industry to be essentially trying to get government to give them guidance?
That's a good question. And I think it is, to an extent, a lobbying arm, but it's also that an investor needs clear information to make any investment decision. And I think some of these initiatives are just products of the fact that the investors don't have the level of clarity that they need to make these medium and long-term decisions as yet. So these partnerships and these initiatives come out of that sort of urge and wish from investors to have clear, usable data that they can apply to several industries.
Yeah, Arya, can I add something to this?
Please.
Yeah, so much like there's a lot of, I would argue, almost deliberate confusion in the ESG space in terms of what is an ESG portfolio, what is an ESG investment. I feel like there's a lot of confusion, and in some cases, perhaps even deliberate, about what constitutes net zero. So taking Apple, for instance, I think it was Apple. A few years back, they reported that they had achieved net zero for their operations. Wow, okay, pat on the back. That sounds fantastic. But if you actually look into it, Apple's operations only constituted about 2% of the greenhouse gas emissions that they were ultimately responsible for. So some people called them out on it, and now they have a broader net zero plan for the corporation. We'll see how far that goes. A lot of things get tied in net zero, which arguably should not be there. I've seen net zero roadmaps which allow for greater use of biomass and biofuels. So basically, the logic that's behind that is this is not fossil carbon. So if we burn things like wood and ethanol, we're not actually releasing new carbon into the atmosphere because this was produced from biofuels. But if you follow that logic, too far down, then you're basically making the argument that we need to clear out the forests and, pave them over with fields of corn in order to achieve net zero. And that's ridiculous on its face, right? So the clarity of these definitions is very, very important. And I think Arya is highlighting that, how important that is. David, I think you're muted.
All right, is it the case, John, that if a company is burning biofuels or getting energy from biofuel sources, that they can avoid even reporting any emissions consequence of that in their emissions reporting?
Yeah, in many cases it is. In many carbon accounting frameworks I've seen, including, I think, the GHG protocol, which is the most widely used, biofuel consumption is defined as having an emissions factor of 0 because the carbon is supposed to have been absorbed in the recent past by the products which went into these biofuels, be it forestry, be it corn.
So let's just say I was mobile, right? And I'm trying to report my scope 3 emissions, which are the impact of my emissions used by my customer, the emissions created by my customers, if I understand it correctly, right? And they have 10% ethanol in their gas, right? So they could basically just cut 10% off their estimate or whatever, even an accurate measurement, because 10% of the fuel that their customers are burning is from ethanol. Is that?
Yeah.
That's such bullshit.
Yeah, I believe so. And you also touched on a different point here, which is that by defining scope 3 emissions so that companies can voluntarily include downstream emissions as well, without specifying how far that goes or including any constraints on it, it means that once again, companies can claim reductions which they are not actually responsible for. Wow. So Mobil, for example, Mobil is a gasoline company, right? And we have had this whole series of federal regulations making it so that cars are mandated to be more efficient. So now Mobil, by looking at their downstream emissions, can say, well, our end customers are burning less gasoline per mile driven. So we have made an emissions reduction. But it wasn't really you, was it?
Well, it would depend on how much gas they're selling too. But rather than dig down that further, I'd love to go back to Arya because there's a lot of other pretty cool little lines in your chart I want to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the idea behind this chart is to show the fragmented nature of the commitments that are being made. The Paris Aligned Investment Initiative, which you see here, is one of the early commitments. It was made in 2015. It was one of the early net zero commitments. There's also the Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a very interesting initiative. This initiative is basically an investor-led initiative to push for change in the 100 largest publicly traded companies in the world. It's since expanded to include a few more companies. And then there's also some of the original sort of founding initiatives in the ESG/net zero/climate commitment space. The Principles for Responsible Investment were some of the earliest ESG focused principles, and they were published in 2006. It's signed really all over the world. Asset managers in India, asset managers in the US, asset managers all over the world are happy to sign it. And one of the reasons why there are so many commitments and they have, what Mark Carney says is $100 trillion of backing is because the commitments by themselves are not very detailed. Aside from the problem that net zero is not well defined, the commitments themselves are usually less than a page or 2 pages and I'm paraphrasing, not very heavily, but they go along the lines of, we commit to be net zero by 2050. And it's sort of easy for these companies to meet on the sidelines of COP26 when they're heads of state and when finance ministers and central bank leaders are meeting as well and sign these commitment documents and then forget about it and move on. So I think what we're seeing here is a little bit of a reflection of what's going on in the carbon accounting space itself. And maybe that's one of the reasons why, is that there's a lot of fragmented commitments, there's a lot of overlap, but there's very little standardization, there's very little defining of the problem and the scope of the solution. and there's even less of any actual change being made.
So Arya, and by the way, I just asked anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment to put it in the Q&A or raise your hand using the raise hand function in Zoom here. But Arya, I think kind of the whole reason we started going down this path is you and I were having lunch and you were explaining to me your own distress, really, of what it was really, as you just stated it, that there is all this rhetoric, but I think we could applaud the existence of pretty much every single circle on this chart. But if what we definitely, absolutely, unequivocally need is measurable progress towards reduced emissions, we're not really getting that. Is that your opinion? Am I right in paraphrasing you?
Absolutely. I think all of these, there's several reasons why all of these initiatives are popping up. But to my mind, one of the biggest reasons is regulation is really far behind the thinking of the industry. Some of these initiatives are very well intentioned. They have, the right people on the board, the right people convening them. But I think really the issue is that regulation is currently just too far behind.
Okay, well, and I am really eager to hear anyone in the audience who would like to join in, please do so. But that's a good place for me to ask John about something, and Arya, you probably have opinions about this too. You know, one of the more interesting things that came up in our prep call was the fact that Europe has moved so far, not only to have carbon pricing and carbon markets, which we don't have here in the United States, which is also something China has, far, far more advanced than we have in the United States. But Europe is putting into place these things I mentioned before, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which even though they might not have been intended to have the effect, may end up forcing regulation to emerge in every region that has a trading relationship with Europe. Is that an overstatement the way I just said it, John?
No, not really. I mean, some regions would be excluded. I think that the way the CBAM is drafted right now, it doesn't include any sort of imposition on least developed countries. But I think that's one of the only exclusions, and that exclusion is there because they reason that these countries are neither currently nor have they ever been a historical contributor to emissions.
Right.
So
quickly summarize how the CBAM would work and why you think it has these sort of second and third order implications.
Yeah, so a carbon border adjustment mechanism looks at the carbon intensity of products which are produced domestically, and then the carbon intensity for the same products when they are produced in a foreign environment and then imported. And if the products coming from outside the border are more carbon intensive, then a tax is assessed based on the additional carbon which is attributable to that product. So it's a way to use your international trade system to expand the influence of a domestic carbon tax. Now, under WTO regulations, you can't do something like this unless you have a carbon price domestically as well. Because if you're taxing something from abroad, you have to tax it at home as well. That's how the WTO works in the broadest strokes. And so because of that, the CBAM is something which the EU can only implement because they already have their own system going on. But it's going to possibly lead to a lot of tariffs which will be faced by the United States unless they introduce some sort of carbon pricing domestically as well. So surprisingly, there's actually a lot of movement towards introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the US by people who you wouldn't expect. Senator Bill Cassidy, who's a Republican, has actually introduced an energy plan which incorporates a carbon border adjustment mechanism. The rationale there is mainly for the protection of American industry, right? Because most places, regardless of how dirty the US is, most places where we import products from still produce more GHG emissions than we do, China in particular, right? The most advanced bill is by Sheldon Whitehouse, the Democrat from Rhode Island. So over time, if we do this, according to WTO requirements, we're going to have to couple it with carbon price as well. Otherwise, we won't be allowed to keep it. And ultimately, what we could see evolve here is countries which have these kinds of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which effectively tariff anything which is more GHG intensive than what they produce, could see them coalesce into something called a carbon club, which is more or less a free trade zone based on having a low rate of GHG emissions based on measuring those emissions and reporting them. So through the WTO, Europe is basically twisting our arm, and our politicians amazingly are responding to it.
But essentially, if you were to have a carbon price as they have in Europe, I mean, it's sort of odd for me to understand how that could even be the case if they still, even there, don't have effective accounting mechanisms. I know they do use.
Hold on.
Can
I
you
think
hear
your
me?
audio cut out for me.
Oops. Basically, I'm just saying that it all goes back to the accounting necessarily.
Internet.
Any of these
Okay,
things,
now I hear you.
I was just saying it all goes back to accounting, and eventually, if any of these things are really going to work, even carbon pricing in Europe or China can only really be implemented effectively if they're somehow got some real tools to determine who is emitting what, and so that if, especially if you're paying money because of your emissions, you want to have any improvements accurately accounted for, right? So I would assume that the more pricing mechanisms are implemented and enforced, the more accounting mechanisms would almost inevitably follow in their wake. Wouldn't that be the case?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case, especially since goods that cross borders are not always simple things like cement, iron, steel, aluminum. They're often far more complex than that and have a far more complex range of inputs. So for that reason, I would say that the carbon accounting space is evolving the direction of what's called the E-Liability Approach. So what the E-Liability Approach does is it's very similar to how financial accounting works under GAAPs or IFRS, is it takes a product and takes the emissions measured or estimated directly on site from that product, and then attaches those emissions as a packet as they're sent down the supply chain to the next producer. So this sort of accumulates and accumulates and accumulates, and eventually you have the carbon emissions which are associated with that product as a whole. That's distinct from how it works today, where we have measurement taking place from these central industry points based on the way in which the carbon accounting system evolved, and who we then make responsible for examining the emissions upstream of their operations, downstream of their operations, in ways which very easily lead to overlap. Now, there are some technology applications which can potentially help an e-liability system take shape as well. There are a lot of institutions, companies, initiatives which are trying to introduce blockchain to this. So they're thinking, okay, we look at the emissions associated with this product, we package that together with the product in the blockchain, and then it is sent down the supply chain. I would argue that blockchain is not the best. It's a solution in search of a problem here, because blockchain emphasizes a level of information security, which is not particularly necessary here. I think having just a distributed database is enough. And additionally, blockchain is associated with such a disproportionate level of emissions that using it for emissions reporting seems to me like it would be missing the point.
Yes, that's interesting. Well, Arya, jump in with any observations or things that we're leaving out or anything. One thing that I want to make sure we touch on before we finish, and either one of you that have opinions on this, I'd love to hear. We've seen this astonishing accomplishment just, emerge in the Senate, and it looks likely to get approved in the House, called the Inflation Reduction Act, with, slightly less than $400 billion worth of ostensible climate-related factors included, which is a huge historic achievement. Does that bill in itself have in it features that will improve accounting per se or require it?
I don't believe so, no. Not to my knowledge.
That's too bad. But it does have a lot of features that will, in effect, amount to lower, I mean, obviously lower emissions. But when somebody like Chuck Schumer says, oh, well, we were initially hoping for 45% reductions by 2030, and this bill gives us 40%, which is still great. So that kind of claim is, to go back to the beginning of this whole conversation, essentially based on extremely shaky measurement and accounting foundations.
I think most of that claim is related to investments in infrastructure. I think it's related to funding in renewable energy, mode shift to transportation, etc. So I am not so familiar at this point with how the carbon accounting works for those spaces. But the emissions which are coming from industry and manufacturing, which is a huge chunk of the pie, it doesn't really do anything about that. And I'd also mention that what they can do is constrained by the reconciliation framework, right? They are only allowed to include things under reconciliation which directly affect the budget, either in a positive or negative direction. It has to equal out to zero. The parliamentarian can take anything out they want, right? And then, we still have the Supreme Court as well, which we have to contend with. So there's a lot of upwind factors, but I think there's a lot of potential and hope as well.
Yeah, wow. Arya, what have we left out of this conversation that we need to be thinking about here?
I think we've covered a lot of a wide variety of ideas and topics. I think one of the things that I like to talk about when I'm thinking about carbon accounting is we have to change the purpose and the way we view the purpose of carbon accounting. If you look at why accounting standards became the law for publicly traded companies, it's because people lost their money in crashes because of fraud, because of duplicitousness, and because of just a lack of standardization. And oftentimes I think people don't realize that there are crises taking place that need us to have carbon accounting. I mean, the fact that England went through a heat wave last month, New York is going through something of heat wave, is in my mind equivalent to a crash, a financial market crash in the 1930s or in the 1940s that led to a lot of the regulations that have become the GATT standards. So I think just the fact that carbon accounting doesn't always seem urgent because we don't always zoom out enough to look at how the lack of standardization and how the lack of emissions reporting is affecting the whole of the economy and the world in itself. I think a lot of the crises that we're facing, California's wildfires, are a result of the fact that we're just not having honest numbers to deal with on the table, and that is affecting us detrimentally.
Wow. And yeah, I would add also that what we need more than anything is an accounting system which is unimpeachable and fully credible, especially if there's ultimately going to be money tied to it. What we have right now is something which is distinct from financial accounting, that there is a lot of emotion and even in some respects ideology which are tied to it. We always see these headlines about how there's 100 companies which are responsible for 70% of climate change, right? And that's based on this assumption that they're responsible for all the downstream effects of their products as well. But that's something which, manufacturers create those emissions, consumers create those emissions. And by not having a fully dispassionate system, we're sort of focusing the responsibility in ways which will not solve the problem. So to paraphrase Spider-Man, with great responsibility comes great power. And so we should really focus on assigning the responsibility where it should be as objectively as possible if we want to influence the system in the best way that we can.
Interesting. And I mean, there actually are apps today that allow individuals to try to estimate their own carbon intensity. But what you're really implying is that what we really need ultimately is measurements that go all the way down to our own individual daily acts that would allow us to, with some degree of accuracy, understand the implications of our choices, right? That's a big deal and a long way from where we are. I do think you know, whereas maybe New York's heat wave right now could have happened in any time in my lifetime, what's happening in Europe right now could not have happened anytime in my lifetime, or northern Mexico, both of places where they are having historic droughts and heat waves that are causing massive societal disruption and difficulty, really all across Europe, with, you know, hydroelectric being impacted, forced people who don't have air conditioning suffering under extreme temperatures, water shortages. There was an amazing article in the New York Times about Monterrey, Mexico, which is a city of 4 million people that essentially doesn't have water at the moment. And these things are going to get worse. And I guess maybe the final question to ask you both is, it just from your gut, given we've talked a lot about problems in this discussion, do you think we're likely to make pretty rapid progress as we all sort of, as a planet, digest the severity of the climate impacts that are increasingly obviously caused by climate change?
Arya, you want to do this one first?
Sure, I can. You know, David, you asked me the same question at the end of lunch after I put you in a bit of a glum mood, but I told you that I'm still optimistic, and I think that the very fact that there is a lot of initiatives and a lot of great people are working on it, and the vast majority of initiatives and individuals are well-intentioned, does sort of put my mind at ease to the fact that we will get there. Will we get there in time is a question that I cannot answer. But I think, as John said, the best thing that we can do is sort of remove ideology from this process, and try and make these as objective as possible so that we can achieve something that really works towards putting some sort of dampener on the climate crisis over the next few decades.
Yeah, it sounds like a huge lift to remove, ideology from climate change. But the fact is, it's there. It is a risk that everyone faces. The pressure is absolutely there right now to reduce emissions. I think it's sufficient to keep it within the goals that we've set. But alongside that, we also need focus as well, right? We can't engage in blame shifting. We have to ensure that this pressure is going to the right places, to the levers that can actually make change. And that's an area where we need to make some improvements.
Wow, well, very interesting conversation. You're both really well informed. We all need to be far better informed about this stuff. I thank everyone for joining us. Please come on September 20th to the Health and Wealth of Our Planet at City Winery right near Chelsea Market. Stay tuned, because next week there will be another roundtable on Web3 and sustainability, which will be essentially a discussion/debate between me and Dan Costa, who is our in-house expert here at Taconomy in Clareham on Web3. So that'll be at the same time next Thursday at 1 o'clock. Arya will be speaking at the Taconomy and Worth Health and Wealth of Our Planet, talking about this same topic with a panel. Unfortunately, John's going to be out of town, so we'll miss him. But we just learned while this session was underway that Eileen Fisher is going to be speaking at that conference. Eileen Fisher is probably the company of all companies that I could think of that has taken more responsible steps over more decades. It's not the hugest company, but that is really probably the standard bearer for sustainable responsibility in business, and especially in fashion. So that was a good piece of news we just got in the last hour. Thank you again to everybody. Thank you to Arya. Thank you to John. And we'll see you all next week at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, everybody.